President Joe Biden's approval rating with Black Americans has fallen nearly 20 points, according to a new NBC poll. The survey shows a 64% approval rating with the group surveyed, down from 83% 9 months ago. Other polls have shown a similar trend of deflating support among this group. Black voters cite disappointment over the Democrats' failure to pass voting rights legislation, police reform, and a frustration over the rise in costs for food and basic goods.
Joining us to discuss are Democratic strategist Alencia Johnson and advisor at the Renew Democracy Initiative, Rena Shaw. Welcome to you both.
Hey, good morning.
So, Alencia, what can the Democrats do to reverse this? Because, I mean, they've had a lot of their kind of legislative goals very rudely shot down, and it's just like the wrong trajectory. What can be done at this point?
You know, I think first Democrats have to remind themselves that the reason that we were so victorious in 2020 is because Black voters, seeing what the opposition was, chose Joe Biden very early on and chose him based on his ability to beat Donald Trump, as well as his commitment to voting rights and being pushed on criminal justice reform. And so, unfortunately, people are frustrated right now because they feel as though we've been kind of tepid, he's been kind of tepid on these issues, and it's kind of the last minute in having this conversation going into midterms. So I think it's twofold. One, if he's not going to get the support that he needs from his own party to at least get a 50-50 vote, he's going to have to look into some executive action on some very critical issues, such as voting rights and criminal justice reform. Now, the Biden White House also needs to do a better job of having these conversations about how infrastructure and the child tax care credit, all of these things that they have done, will impact Black voters. So it's a twofold strategy. And quite frankly, we're already in 2022, and they need to start doing that right now with some urgency.
Rena, do you think that Republicans are looking at this eagerly, thinking that there's going to be a bid for some of these voters, or is the goal here just to make Black voters stay at home the way they've done in previous election cycles when they have felt like their needs weren't served by the Democratic Party?
Well, I think the bid has been there for some time. I think what we saw in Trump's second run was a real concerted effort to embrace Black Americans. And I think that was not by design entirely. It's something that always I've seen has cropped up at the 11th hour by the RNC. So it's something that, again, not purely by design, but something that they know that the Democrats are failing Black voters on many levels, and particularly when it comes to these voting rights bills. And so what they're doing right now, national Republicans, is seeing an entryway to talk about opportunity and talk about sort of that frustration. Have Democrats really served you for decades? Are your communities safer? Is your pocketbook more full? Things of that sort. And so in essence,
is your school open?
Well, I think you bring up a great point there, is that when we get to this fall, education, in my opinion, will be the dominating issue, because whether you're Black, white, or whatever you may be, brown like me, you are suffering from some form of lack of childcare in some way, whether it's trickling down into the exorbitant cost of childcare coming and forcing two income homes to really reassess sort of their plans, or to look at and really say, what are our schools doing for our kids? Are my kids being left behind? So overwhelmingly, there is an entryway here. I don't think it's all out, though, here to say that Black Americans are completely rejecting Democrats and that this will continue this trend. I think these are sort of the natural numbers of the moment.
Yeah, I don't think so either. But education is becoming a more and more important issue. We're seeing the effects of the school policies on the Virginia gubernatorial results. I think we're seeing them everywhere. I think this is an issue that it matters to everyone, but maybe Democrats are not appreciating how it matters to voters in minority communities. Alencia, do you think the Democrats are taking this seriously?
I think, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the Virginia race. I'm a Virginia native. I live in Virginia, and I was involved in Terry McAuliffe's campaign. The reality is, I think that win actually woke up Democrats to the fact that this conversation about quote unquote critical race theory is more than actually just a conversation. It is a strategy that Republicans are using in order to rally up their base and get them charged up and to push back on policies and to think that education is under attack, when the reality is they are trying to not have real conversations in schools. And so the Democrats' challenge is we have to figure out a way to push back on that rhetoric and have this conversation about education, and not just what's taught in school, but what we were talking about just before, the fact that people want their children in schools in a safe environment with the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Will there be mask mandates and testing and all of these different things? And so we're having this conversation of the substance of what kids are being taught, as well as being safe in school, because that is the childcare that so many Black Americans need in order to go to work every day.
Yeah, to that point, earlier on the show, we discussed a new poll that shows that parents are growing more concerned about their kids' education and the effects of virtual learning. And this is disproportionately affecting a lot of Black and brown kids. Students in Flint, Michigan will stay home indefinitely starting this week. The superintendent who made the call to go virtual cited the county's 38.4% positivity rate. Flint's school district is made up of a 90% enrollment in minorities, more than 80% economically disadvantaged, and more than 74% are Black. Are Democrats having a sufficient conversation about the fact that this is, in fact, a child care issue and not just this culture war battle, Alencia?
I don't think we're having that conversation right now. And I am saying that in hopes that my friends who are working on these issues are listening. This is a childcare issue. This is a healthcare issue. When we look at impoverished communities, low-income communities that are sometimes overwhelmingly for marginalized communities, we have to also realize this is where some kids are getting their nutrition, right? They're not getting substantive nutrition anywhere else but at school. And so when children are not in school, it has a ripple effect on their development. It has a ripple effect on their ability to get ahead. It has so many different impacts that folks are not just talking about. And the psychological toll that it's taking in this COVID-19 pandemic is extremely alarming when we're talking about the mental health challenges that are happening across the nation. I was listening to a report in Chicago and they were interviewing children who were saying this is so hard being at home and not socializing. What is that doing for their development? And so I think we have to talk about education as a Black issue. To the first question you asked me earlier, this is an issue for Black families, no matter the socioeconomic status.
Yeah. Well, in Mississippi, every Black member of the state Senate walked out as their colleagues voted to approve a bill the Republicans have described as legislation to prevent critical race theory from being taught in schools. Rena, I think this is a complicated issue. Obviously, some of what gets described, critical race theory is an imprecise term to describe some of the things we're talking about. I do think there are legitimate questions, or parents are right in many cases to be not thrilled about some of the curriculum. There's a difficulty in, you want to empower parents to be involved in the educational process. You don't want parents to be able to say, well, my kids can't read Toni Morrison or something like that. So the legislative route is very fraught, but some of this stuff I don't think belongs in school. So how would you advise Republicans to handle this? Probably it's good political strategy to maximum, no, we're going to not have critical race theory, but then it's in practical terms, what are we even talking about?
Well, in Virginia, for example, critical race theory isn't even taught in schools that my children attend. For example, I have an elementary schooler, and of course, I'm now more attuned to what's being taught in schools. My child is in kindergarten. I should preface with that, so I have some time to really think about this, and realize that.
Glad your kindergartner's not being taught it, right? But maybe later in the school they might have some kind of ethnic studies requirement. That it's not going to be. They're not going to be, sitting and reading Kimberly Crenshaw, but they might be something.
But that's a really fast track, Robbie. These things don't happen that fast. And let's talk about book banning on top of that, which is what I'm far more concerned about. I hate the idea of book bans. I think it's absolutely completely the opposite of what conservatives should be embracing. We should want the freedom for our children of a certain age to be exposed to certain things. Now, pornographic content, things like that, I'm all for parents finding that stuff, calling it out, and being absolutely outraged. There are moments that demand our alarm. And I think one big reason we don't have Governor McAuliffe again in Virginia is because of his missteps, how he misspoke about parents being involved in schools. What I really, really want to take this to is a conversation on school choice, Robbie. You and I both know that.
Yes.
This is imperative that we get people waking up to the very fact that we are almost victims as taxpayers to what public education wants to serve us at their whim. We are almost in a place where we actually have been sort of taken, the power is no longer the hands of the parents. And that really feels odd to say. I say that having had a child who did virtual learning this past Thursday and then had teacher work days on Friday and today. I've been really thinking about the plight of a parent that doesn't have the resources that I do. And I think that when I look at my school district, I got my kid into a lottery program and now she's in a magnet school. Why shouldn't parents have vouchers? Why shouldn't parents be given these vouchers to go and choose a school of their choice? This is what we need to talk about to get our kids really in a finer place. American students are definitely going to be left behind by virtual learning. They've been left behind for decades because of our inability to really meet the moment when it comes to math and science. And I fear what we are doing when we keep talking about culture wars, and don't think about actual systemic reforms that could happen to empower every single American student, Black and brown, of course. But I really, really think that every American student is going to be left behind if more school districts do what Flint did. Horrible.
Well, where is the critique here? Because of the Republican Party, because taking this Mississippi law as an example, the law basically says you can't teach that one racial group, one ethnicity is better than the other, superior to another intrinsically, which of course nobody is doing and not what CRT is. But what is happening here is this boogeyman of CRT is being put out there to make people feel like there is something bad going on at schools, that they do have to get involved, that the control of their students' learning is even more out of their hands, not just because of COVID, but because of these substantive reasons. Lindsay, how do Democrats address this issue without being caught into this weird definitional battle about what CRT is? How do you get around that when they keep laying these traps like this Mississippi bill that really on substance isn't objectionable except for what it represents in the middle of this culture war?
You know, it's a very, very hard culture war to push back on. And this isn't the first time that Democrats have had to figure out a culture war to push back on, right? We think about abortion rights, we think about same-sex marriage. There's so many times that Republicans will pick a culture war that kind of traps Democrats because we are a party that likes to embrace different ideology. But the thing about critical race theory, I think there's a fundamental education that a lot of journalists are doing, which is amazing, that most people will never actually encounter a critical race theory class unless you go to law school. But the conversation that we have to have is that we have to talk about history as it is. The feelings of being inferior or not, that is just a feeling actually uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable in your history class. What's not okay is to kind of wash the truth that has led to some of the systemic outcomes that so many people are challenged with and facing day to day. And so Democrats actually should kind of go on a road tour, go to some of these states, go to rural areas, go to Midwestern areas, go to different states and actually have conversations with parents who disagree with the Republican strategy, but have a conversation with them on what actually would get them out to vote, what actually would get them to go up to the school district, the school district conversations and say, we actually stand for this. We actually think that what you're saying is wrong, and we want our children to be taught the real history. We both on this panel have talked about Virginia school systems. As growing up here in Virginia, I had to go to Jamestown on field trips. I had to go to George Washington's homes on field trips. And I had questions. I had questions about my ancestors. And so we need to put teachers in a position to be able to answer those questions. What are we going to do? Fine teachers for not being able to talk about real history? So that's the conversation that Democrats need to start having and showing what this would look like on the ground and making this more real for our base so that we have something to respond with.
Well, we got to leave it there, but great discussion. Thank you so much, Lindsay and Rena, for joining us.
More Rising after this.